When Amnesty International started to work on business and human rights 15 years ago, it was very difficult at this time to promote the respect of human rights by the private sector. And when we approached companies to speak with them about their duty to respect human rights, we were always told that it was the duty of the states to protect human rights and that companies would not interfere in this internal affairs.
This attitude not to interfere with internal affairs cost Ken Saro's life in Nigeria in 1995 with 8 other human rights defenders of the Ogoni people. And they were fighting together oil companies like Shell because of the pollution of the Niger Delta. And when the Abacha regime condemned Ken Saro, this famous writer, and 8 fellows, when they condemned them to death after a fake trial, we asked Shell to intervene with the government, with the Nigerian government. We asked them to do that, and they said, no, we are not going to interfere with internal affairs. I have to say that in the last decade, the situation has changed, fortunately, and thank many campaigns of civil society organizations, and thank Professor Ruggie, the special representative on business and human rights at the UN level. Now companies are well known to have also a responsibility in terms of human rights everywhere in the world. Let me start with a concrete example, Glencore. Glencore is a mining company. It's the world's largest commodities trading company, and they extract zinc and copper mainly. But who knows that Glencore is a Swiss company? They are based in Basel, but they are very discreet. And who knows, for example, that in the DRC, where Glencore works with Congolese companies, there are many violations of human rights and environmental rights. For example, thousands of children work in these mines. The working conditions are very poor and dangerous, and for the extraction they use sulfuric acid, and the acid is then thrown away in the river. The entire region is polluted, and there are no fish left in the river. Allegations of human rights abuses are particularly high in the extractive industry, oil, gas, and mining. As consumers, we don't usually know that extractive industry has a negative impact. And when we buy jewelry, for example, diamonds or gold, we are not aware of the consequences of what we buy. Maybe you don't buy diamonds every day, me neither, but you surely have a mobile phone. And who knows, when you buy a mobile phone, that there can be also consequences of the extractive industry for example, the minerals such as coltan, which is in every mobile phone. And that could lead to a war in the country where this coltan is extracted. Is this situation acceptable? Is business acceptable at any cost? No, it's not. And this is why today we need to bring binding norms for companies and greater state regulation of corporate actors, including in Switzerland, particularly with respect to operations conducted abroad. And this is what I'm going to tell you this afternoon. Companies today often have more political and economic power than states, than governments. It is estimated that half of the 100 biggest economies in the world are businesses, not states. At the international level, there is a system in place to monitor what governments are doing and, if necessary, to impose sanctions. There is a UN system, there are international treaties ratified by the states, there are international bodies to monitor if states respect their duties. But who monitor transnational corporations? There is a big lack of international and national regulation. And over the past 20 years, we have also seen the expansion of national and international law to protect global economic interests through a range of international agreements on trade and intellectual property rights. These agreements are backed by robust enforcement mechanisms like international arbitration. However, while economic interests have been able to make law work for them, they have always opposed international regulation for companies in terms of human rights abuses. Companies have a responsibility for the human rights impact of their operation. Of course, this impact can be very positive: creation of jobs, new technologies, life-saving drugs, and so on. However, they have also a responsibility for the human rights abuses they provoke. For example, child labor and corporate collusion with repressive governments. If child labor is forbidden in Switzerland, why should we accept that a Swiss company uses child labor elsewhere in the world and in violation of local legislation? There are plenty of examples of companies involved in human rights violations. For example, Yahoo and Google helped the censorship in China by giving names of bloggers to the Chinese authorities. Last year, during the first demonstration in Egypt against Mubarak regime, the British company Vodafone cut down the mobile network because the Mubarak regime asked them to. Companies also have a responsibility for the environmental damage they cause. For example, with the pollution of the environment, which has a broad impact on people's right to health, to safe environment, and to live in dignity. It is not acceptable that Shell refuses to inform the local population of the Niger Delta about the pollution they have caused there for decades. All these examples show that there is a need for specific regulation for companies on their human rights and environmental impact. But the corporate responsibility to respect human rights can't be dependent on the goodwill of companies. Voluntary initiatives are not enough. When we confront companies with human rights abuses, many immediately point to their charitable projects, such as building a health center or providing books to a local school. And of course, there is nothing wrong with charity and corporate philanthropy. But positive action in one area doesn't absolve any actor of responsibilities for human rights violations elsewhere. Building a health center doesn't allow a company to walk away from polluting the community's water, for example. And unfortunately, some voluntary initiatives are only about acquiring a green image or a social image. Control and sanction mechanisms are either absent or very weakly formulated. So there is a need of norms and binding regulation that apply equally to everyone. And we need to be able to measure the improvements and to sanction companies who violate human rights. We need to improve the access to justice for victims of corporate abuse. In India, in Bhopal to be more specific, there was a big explosion of a chemical plant 27 years ago. The subsequent massive gas leak killed more than 7,000 persons in 1984, and a further 15,000 during over the next 20 years. The toxic waste was left in the abandoned site, and neither the company nor the Indian government have, even to this day, cleaned up the site to prevent further contamination. Despite the devastating impact of this very big contamination, no one has been held to account for the gas leaks and the contamination. More than 100,000 continue to suffer from serious health problems. In 2001, Dow Chemical became the sole owner of the Union Carbide Corporation. The European headquarters of Dow Chemical is in Switzerland. But the victims in Bhopal have no way to sue Dow Chemicals here in Switzerland. It is crucial to help the victims to take a civil case outside of the country to courts, especially when the local courts are compromised, or when it is the corporate headquarters that is the entity from which to seek compensation. The discussion about how to bring companies to respect human rights has been very intense during the last decade at the UN level. It started with the UN Global Compact, then the special representative, John Ruggie, was appointed, and last June he published his framework and guiding principles on business and human rights, and they were approved by a resolution at the UN level. These principles stipulate that it's the duty of state to protect, that there is a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and that victims should have access to remedies. These principles are a very big step, but they are not binding. Without a binding regulation, there will always be companies that will act responsibly, and there will always be companies that won't. Without this regulation, we are too dependent on the goodwill of companies. Some corporations understood since many years that there are many benefits to respect human rights, both commercial and social. For example, more secure license to operate, better quality of the product, improved stakeholder relations, and social benefits like more stable employment opportunities. It is now time for states to adopt binding regulation for corporations based in their countries. Switzerland is a heaven for multinationals, and so we have a particular responsibility to meet. This is why 50 Swiss organizations with Amnesty International launched a campaign in November last year, and we are calling on the government, the Swiss government and the parliament, for binding rules to ensure that companies headquartered in Switzerland observe human rights and environmental standards worldwide. Of course, law is not the solution for all human rights problems, but law is a solid foundation on which to build sustainable relations and solutions. Human rights are guarantees, they are not privileges. They should never depend on the goodwill of good companies or good governments. And it's time for business to become part of the solution instead of being part of the problem. Thank you for supporting our call, and thank you for your attention.